Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
We understand, the power of the opposite and what we need to do to create that change. Like, I feel like, these stories, and hopefully the Completionists too, they're about hope. They're about, like being a good person and keeping your hope and your humanity in a world and in a place where that's really at risk. And that's really like our essential challenge right now.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 44, the last palindrome this year. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Siobhan Adcock about her book, The Completionist. Siobhan Adcock is the author of the novels The Barter and The Completionist. Her short fiction has been published in Tri Quarterly and the Massachusetts Review, and her essays and humor writing have appeared in Salon, The Daily Beast, and Huffington Post. She lives with her husband and daughter in Brooklyn. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, everyone, I am here with Siobhan Adcock, author of The Completionist. Siobhan, say hello.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too. This book was intense and interesting, and I am so excited to talk with you about it. So the book is The Completionist, and just came out, I think, a couple months ago.
That's right. It came out in June.
Yeah. So still a chance everyone pick it up for that late summer read. But I think what I always like to do is just, in your own words, just kind of summarize the book for us. What's it all about?
Sure. So The Completionist is a mystery set in a near future world in which climate change and some technological shifts have created a number of changes in everyday life. And one of the things that's happening in this novel is that there's a fertility crisis that is impacting women in some very specific ways, having to do with sort of their economic freedoms as well as their reproductive freedoms. And in this world, a young veteran of a decades-long resource war fought over water, Carter, has returned home to try to find his sister, who has gone missing after a few months of kind of strange behavior. And at the same time, his other sister is miraculously pregnant, which is a really sort of unusual event in this near future world. So the clock is ticking on a couple of different fronts for him to try to help both of his sisters. And he, as he's sort of investigating this, he's realizing that his entire family may be implicated in his sister's disappearance.
Yeah, that's a great setting the stage there. And I think that's interesting you say that, because it is really a mystery at its heart, but there's so many other elements to it that you can look at it from a bunch of different angles as you try and figure out what's happening.
I hope so. Yeah, I think that if you're interested in climate change fiction, there's a piece of that. If you're interested in just sort of straightforward mysteries, it's very influenced by a lot of sort of classic mysteries. If you are interested in sort of near future dystopias or anything like The Handmaid's Tale, that's definitely the world that it's traveling in as well. So I hope that there's a couple of different ways into the story. And for me, really, it's kind of about this family and the dynamics between the characters.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to start off with just a little writing creative process questions, and then we'll kind of get into the meat of the
I
book.
love process
Oh,
questions. They're
good. Oh,
so
good. Because everyone does it their own way. You know, everyone
yes.
manages somehow to come up with their own solution to that problem of how do we get from nothing to something.
Totally, right?
So
And process means different things to different people. I mean, you ask some people about their process, and they're like, by process, you mean sitting in front of a laptop, right? And then for other
yeah,
people, it's like this whole it sort of opens up this whole trapdoor into, well, how do you construct a plot, and how do you construct characters, and what are the exercises you go through, and what are the hoops you jump through? And I guess for me, I love the sort of the duality of the plotter versus the pantser. Have you heard about this? This is maybe like
no, tell me
if
more.
you if you do NaNoWriMo National Novel Writing Month, this is something that I've never done it, but I know people who have, and it's been a great exercise for them. But there's people who identify as plotters and people who identify as pantsers. That is by the seat of your pants. So there are some people who just kind of jump in and go as fast as they can and as far as they can. And there are some people who, really need to sit down and think about some elements of plot and how to get from point A to point B. I'm definitely in the second camp. I'm a plotter and not a pantser. It makes me, my hat is off to pantsers. And I guess their pants are off, but then I am also, I'm just like a little bit more structured than that. I have a couple of, exercises that I do that were inspired by a really great book that was recommended to me by another writer. It's called The Art of Story by John Truby. And he kind of encourages you to build a character map that helps you understand not just your protagonist and what they're after, but all of the sort of constellation of characters that you have in play around that main character and what each of them wants and how each of them needs to kind of move through the plot. So for me, that's a really helpful exercise in getting myself from point A to point B, which is really, the goal. And you have to sit down in front of the laptop. And that also is part of the process, right? Like, how do you actually make time for your writing, which was really the hardest part for me as a working mother of, writing a novel. How do you find the time to, get your thoughts down on paper? How do you find the time to even do these, initial exploratory exercises where you're trying to figure out who these people are and what the story is that you're trying to tell? So the process also includes that question of just like, how do you carve out time? And that's also an interesting way. All writers come at that in a different way. I used to be a morning writer. I used to have like a beautiful, serene morning writing routine. I would wake up at dawn and have a relationship with my coffee cup and have like a whole thing happening in the morning. And, it's like these beautiful sacred hours before my husband got up or whoever else, my roommates. But then after I had kids, I'm sorry, not kids. I just have the one kid. But after I had my daughter, I just found my writing process needed to change. I needed to find different ways of carving out time and different ways of sort of bargaining with myself to make the time when there are so many other competing tasks and interests and, just things to do. You want to prioritize the writing, but you also have to keep living your life. So my writing process as a working parent really became kind of bargained with yourself. You only have to do it for 15 minutes. And if you go longer than 15 minutes, amazing. And if you only make it 15 minutes, you've still kept your covenant with yourself as a writer. The real thing is you have to do it every day. Like the dailiness of it is the important thing, because what I found is that if you try to tell yourself you're going to sit down and write an hour every day, that's just like, I don't know, as a working parent, I just feel like that's impossible. But 15 minutes of something every day, that you can do. And if you're doing it every day, some part of your brain is always working on it. There's something about the dailiness effect that makes it so that even when you're not sitting down and writing, you're still thinking about it. I know writers who are also working parents who write on the weekends, right? Like they have childcare, or like their partner comes in and helps them care for the kids. And so they have like, dedicated writing time on the weekend. But when I did that, I, spent half the time just reminding myself what the hell I was talking about.
Like getting back up to speed again.
Yeah, exactly. You spend like half of your writing time just rereading the last 25 pages you're reading. You're like, oh yeah, that's what was going on. It's like, one of those, like just like a serial that doesn't update fast enough and you can't remember what happened in the last episode. So yeah, for me, it's like small chunks of time given out daily.
Yeah, that sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
One of the other things I wanted to touch on is that, and you kind of mentioned that, that the mystery aspect, the climate aspects, the family part. I mean, there's just so many different elements to this story. It's very intense. It's told in a very interesting way, and so I wondered sort of where the story came from. Like why did you decide this was the story you had to tell? To what extent do you have any sort of personal connection to what's happening?
No, thanks for asking that. There's kind of two answers to that. One is that my father was a Vietnam veteran, and the main character of this book is a veteran that is sort of loosely based on, I guess, like sort of his voice, although his personality is quite different. And I got my hands on these letters that my father wrote home from Vietnam when he was 19 years old. He did 2 tours of duty in the Marine Corps, sort of on the ground, and saw some heavy action and was, really changed for the rest of his life by his experience there. And some of the letters that I read that he wrote home to my aunt, his older sister, just kind of sparked the idea for this story. And it was something about how even in the middle of this war zone where he's literally fighting for his life and, consumed and surrounded by sort of the threat of danger, a lot of what he's writing about and thinking about and worrying about are his family members back home. And it was this sort of conflict of how do I be a good man in this terrible place? How do I be a man at all? I'm 19 years old in a war zone. Like this is sort of a entrance into sort of adulthood for him that could not have been more hellish and violent. But, he's consumed with like the safety of his sisters back home. And shortly after he returned from the war, as it turned out, one of his sisters, my aunt, disappeared. We don't actually know where she went off to. She kind of ran off and no one's heard from her since. And that was one of the sort of big tragedies of our family. It was like this loss of this sister. And you could see some of the trouble that she was getting into kind of emerging between the lines in these letters that I read from him. So that kind of gave me the nugget of a character and also sort of the nugget of a plot. Like, this young man, a veteran, a combat veteran who is, sort of affiliating being a good person and being a good man with caring for his sisters specifically, and sort of this bond that he's got with his sisters. And one of the sisters is sort of in danger or, under threat. And the other personal connection I would say I have to the story is sort of like the larger world of ideas, I guess, that the story is playing in is, I've worked for many years in women's digital media and have been focusing a lot on women's health issues. And a lot of what sort of confronts the main characters in this novel is this world that we're sort of hurtling toward, in which sort of women's health care is sort of punitive in this terrible way. The United States, you may already be aware, is one of the most dangerous places in the developed world to give birth, just based on sheer maternal mortality rate alone. So there are 800 women in the United States who die every year of preventable complications of pregnancy and childbirth, which is totally unacceptable. But then on top of that, after kids are born, there's just so little institutional or any other kind of support for mothers that there are also 65,000 women who survive childbirth, but who almost die of sort of prenatal care, postnatal care complications. And then, of course, 40% of Americans live in a childcare desert where childcare is either unaffordable or impossible to find. 40% of children in the U.S. Qualify for free lunches. Like, it just sort of goes all the way down the line. It's like we're trying to make having children as difficult as possible and as sort of punitive as possible for parents and for women specifically, who are really the ones who, tend to have to shoulder the burdens of sort of having children economically. So that's a theme that I found myself sort of exploring through the near future world that was the setting for The Completionist, in which the fertility crisis has all these downstream implications that are really scary for how women's health and women's lives are regulated and expected to be in service of these children that they've had, that, like, there's no support for them of any kind, but they're expected to sort of, like, give over their lives to raising them. And, there are sort of penalties for not doing that in the quote unquote right way.
Hmm. Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, let's kind of jump into the beginning of the book and the world of the book.
Okay.
So, thinking about the main characters. So you mentioned sort of our main character is Carter. He's a just returned, vet, and we have a sister who ran away, Gardner, and we have, his other sister who's pregnant. We have their father. So what is their world like as the book is getting started, and kind of who else are any major players that we need to be aware of?
Oh, thanks. Well, so, like, just to set the scene, I guess in this sort of near future world, there is a lack. There's been sort of a ton of climate change related impacts on daily life. And most of the people who are in this world are kind of concentrated in the cities where resources are a little bit easier to get at. But one of the biggest changes is that there's a sort of a water crisis, and we have invented engineered water. And that is what people use if they can access it. It actually costs a lot of money to access engineered water. So things like, shaving or bathing or anything like that, that's sort of, it's changed in a lot of creepy ways that, I won't get into now, but that were a lot of fun to kind of imagine and construct. But one of the things that sort of engineered water has also introduced into this world is this fertility crisis, because no one wants to admit it, but it seems to cause infertility. So mothers are very rare in this world, and children are kind of sadly rare in this world. And it's just like, it's dry, it's hot, it's crowded, it's everybody kind of smells like this artificial soap that you have to use. It's just like it's an unpleasant place to be. And yet there are sort of like these lingering, remnants of the world that we know now. There are bars, there's engineered beer, people still get married, people still, live in houses and, travel in, self-driving cabs, and there's a bus that comes every once in a while. The remaining kids still go to school. So to me, what's interesting about writing in this kind of dystopian near future tradition is that so much of that is about imagining the world that is coming up for us and how we will struggle and contrive to make it, as homey as we can. Like, there are always like these wonderful reminders of our current world in every book that's about the future. And, that's, I think, kind of one of the fun things about writing something that's set in the near future, is that it's really about our current world too, just as much. So in this world, we have Carter, who's the main character, and he's this young veteran who, as I mentioned, kind of just returned home from war because his sister Gardner has gone missing. Gardner is this woman who has been a nurse completionist for the last couple of years. She's been sort of working in women's health in this sort of grassroots, on the ground kind of way, trying to help women who find themselves pregnant in this world navigate a really punitive system of regulations and rules and laws and penalties that apply if you're not doing things the quote unquote right way. And then there's their older sister, Frederica, who everyone calls Fred, who is this sort of brilliant, hot-headed, hard-headed, like not super pleasant, but very funny, I think, character who kind of finds herself pregnant miraculously in the middle of this fertility crisis. And for her, the stakes are high in a very personal way. One of the things that you have to do when you become pregnant in the near future world of this novel is you have to give up your job right away. And you cannot work. And if you work, you are penalized. And it sort of starts with this sort of like care hours idea that you're expected to be contributing to the sort of development of your children. But then it becomes financial penalties once you are sort of far enough in the red with your care hours. So, as this sort of brilliant entrepreneur, Fred finds that what she has to give up is a lot, and it hurts, and it's making her a little like crazy. So she is dealing with that while Carter is trying to find their missing sister. Gardner, as a nurse completionist, is someone that Fred is kind of hoping will help her find a back door or some kind of an out for all of these new restrictions that she's facing down. Although, she realizes that hope might not be fulfilled, and that she's also, really just very worried about why her sister has disappeared and what she was doing before she disappeared. So she kind of tasks Carter with doing the investigation, which she feels like she can't do. And then there's their father, who also fought in the same war that Carter fought in, sort of a generation before he did. And their father is a, kind of a moody, lonely, hard to read person who all of the kids kind of love and fear in equal measure. And it sort of is revealed that he may know more than he's letting on about what happened to their sister.
Mm-hmm. And, so we start the book off with kind of a war scene. And, throughout the book, Carter, as he's going around doing his investigating, trying to figure out what's going on, even just going to, a cocktail reception, whatever it might be, he's dealing with the ramifications of his service. And you kind of insert flashbacks, and we get to kind of see what he was up to. And it's clear this had sort of a tremendous impact on him, like you mentioned. So what really happened to him while he was at war, and how is that affecting what he's doing now and how he goes about his daily life, and even just his health?
Yeah. Well, my when I was trying to figure out sort of what Carter's story was going to be and what the conflicts were that he was going to face, because when you're writing a book, really, like, the game is like, just keep piling on, like, what else could happen to these guys?
Yeah.
Like the classic story arc is get your character up in a tree, throw rocks at him, and get him down from the tree. So what were the rocks that I was going to be throwing at Carter? My father's experience in Vietnam was sort of emotionally devastating for him in a lot of ways, although also emotionally strengthening. And, he was changed forever by his service in many ways. Physically, he also suffered from PTSD and Agent Orange poisoning. And something about that, sort of the ramifications of his service, that was just something that I kind of wanted to build into this character's story as well. So Carter, in the course of fighting in this war that he kind of didn't really believe in and was just there because his father was there, was exposed to some sort of neurochemical agents, basically, that are causing him to have some sort of alarming physical symptoms, which he's grappling with while he's trying to reintegrate back into society in this sort of changed world, and also as he's trying to keep his head together and keep his wits about him and find his sister in this sort of increasingly dangerous labyrinth that he kind of stumbles into. So I think that a lot of the I also happen to work with veterans in a creative writing workshop, and a lot of what veterans are writing about in their stories, whether it's explicitly about war or not, is this sort of struggle to reintegrate parts of yourself and also to integrate yourself into the larger world. Because your experience at war has the capacity to really fracture that, and it's your identity as a father, as a son, as a brother. It's your identity as a patriot. It's your identity as a person, and whatever that means for you. And how do you reintegrate that into a world that just doesn't understand what you've seen or what you've done, or what you've had to do, what you've been asked to do, and then compound that with sort of this the likelihood that you'll also be carrying emotional and or physical after effects home with you, and the challenge becomes really, really great. And I think that the Agent Orange and PTSD are, in my father's experience, I was thinking about them as kind of like metaphors for that difficulty of reintegration. There's just the coming home and reintroducing yourself to people that you thought you knew and that thought that you knew them, but then you're also kind of carrying around this burden of this internal struggle as well, like an illness, like a disease.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of describing it. We really see that struggle as Carter tries to navigate this very confusing world to him.
Yeah.
One of the things, though, I noticed, besides Gardner, there are several other characters that are kind of in the medical profession. There's Gardner's coworker. We see a couple other people from where she works. There's this Dr. Rafik. And you describe them very interestingly as medical professionals as forming their own kind of armed force, who have seen unimaginable, disgusting, beautiful things most people won't. So I'm curious about maybe comparing those. What does that do to them, and how should, if at all, how should that change the way we perceive medical professionals, that we may not think they're not off somewhere else fighting a war, but they're here and they're seeing crazy stuff happen, every day in their lives.
Yeah, and it's really, if you've ever cared for or lived with someone who is struggling with a chronic illness, you really have a complicated but really respectful relationship, I think, with the medical professionals that are caring for them. You really understand the life of service that they are called to, and the grueling training that so many medical professionals have to undergo on their way to their profession. You really also have to think about how being a caregiver in some of the places where care is needed most is, it really is like fighting a war. Like, think about a EMT working in New York City, or think about an OBGYN working in an embattled rural clinic. Think about a community health provider working in a clinic that's constantly on the verge of being shut down. We don't prioritize healthcare for the people who are most vulnerable or most at risk in this country, and the people who are working in that field really deserve our respect. It really is like fighting a battle every day. So for me, that was kind of what I was thinking about when I think about like the analogy between sort of the life of military service and the life of sort of being called to service in the healthcare world. It's the people who are kind of working those miracles every day, on that small grassroots level, really deserve our respect.
Yeah, totally. One thing I did, we talked briefly, there's lots of future tech stuff going on in the book, and it's the future. Things have changed, but the one sort of omnipresent technological advance is the idea of this wearable, and it's sort of the cell phone replacement in essence, and it's it's implanted in various places in our body, and everything's connected, and it's tracking us all the time, and everyone can see where everyone is. And you write in the book, this technology, it's invaded all of us, to the point where we almost have no secrets, but it is also just about all that tethers us to each other. And I thought that was a very interesting way of putting it. And I wanted to ask you what you think privacy means to a society, and because that's that first part, and then thinking about that second part, the extent to which giving that up to be better connected is a Faustian bargain, or is it worth it?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth it in different ways to different people, I suppose. But we have proven in the United States in particular over and over again that we will give up all of our privacy for 5 minutes of convenience. We really just, as consumers, do not seem to have any sense of where those guardrails ought to be. In the UK and in the European Union, laws have been enacted just recently this year to change the way that people's private and personal information is handled. But in the US, we have none of those protections, and we don't even really seem to be asking for them or advocating for them. You kind of walk down the street, or you get on the subway in the morning and you look around, you're just like surrounded by people on their phones or wearing Fitbits, or kind of interacting with this sort of ever-present but invisible world of technology that is connecting us in hundreds of different ways. It's obviously social media, but it's also sort of the location tracking, which is happening for all of us. It's sort of background data that's being collected about our preferences and what we're talking about and where we're going and who we're interacting with. That's just happening constantly with our phones. So there's a lot of technology that we don't even realize we're using in ways that just kind of strip away what we would traditionally think of as our privacy, but it gains us, apparently, this sort of sense of connection to something that's bigger than us, this sort of invisible net that's sort of hanging over all of our heads. We kind of want to be caught in it because it connects us to other people in a way that it seems to be really important to us and is new. I think maybe in 20 years we'll have a rethink about what that means and how that works for people and what that means for their personal data and their privacy. But we don't really seem to be that concerned about our personal private lives or individual selves. We would rather give up that illusion of privacy in order to feel connected to this other world, which is interesting, right? Like, shouldn't we feel more worried about that? I don't know.
It is. I think to some degree, though, to just slightly be devil's advocate, I think to some degree people just aren't aware or they don't understand. I think there's a lot of just mystery that surrounds technology and how it works, and the extent to which we really are being tracked constantly. People may be like, well, yeah, obviously if I open up Google Maps, it's going to track because it needs to know where I am to provide me that service, and it's worth it. But maybe you don't know that your Android phone is actually telling Google where you are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it's like, sure. What's that education trade-off? I wonder if it was actually just made very clear and then put to a vote, a popular vote to the American people, like, is this okay or not? I wonder,
right.
The extent to which people would really be like, But you're right. To some degree, we do enjoy our toys.
We do, true. Right? And because our toys are, they're with us all the time in this very rewarding way, like constant, lovely dopamine hits as often as you want to receive them. And, and there is something comforting about being connected to other people who are not with you. I have I think as conflicted a relationship with social media as anybody else does, but I do have to admire kind of the loveliness of the way that it connects me with friends of mine that I'm not going to see my former college roommate for another 2 years probably, but I am
Hmm.
so happy to still be in her life in this really, instant and gratifying way. So that trade-off to me, you do kind of begin to see like, well, what is the value of that connection versus the value of, kind of, I'm concerned, as we all should be, that my phone is not just tracking my location, but is actually also listening to things that I am talking about with my phone nearby and passing that background information to, to the apps and to the service providers that are on my phone, and they can do with that data what they want. Most companies don't do anything with it because they just haven't developed the technology to, but it's already happening, right? So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think,
I think that's always the one of the more interesting parts about writing dystopian future, work
yeah,
is as you go back and see things start to tend, like you mentioned earlier, start to tend towards something or start to happen or start to lean towards something. I mean, all of that is rooted in it's a projection based on how one particular future that could happen.
yeah. Well, Margaret Atwood once said about The Handmaid's Tale that she didn't put anything into that book that hadn't already happened or that wasn't already happening somewhere in the world. So,
Mm.
as horrible and as inconceivable as the events in the world of that novel seem to us, it's all based in reality. And when you're writing a novel about the near future that sort of considers the impact of personal technology on people's, bodies and also on their relationships with each other, it's really not very difficult to look even just like a tiny way down the road and see, you know, see that future start to take shape. You almost don't even need to. You definitely don't need a crystal ball. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Uh, there's one I wanted to ask you about this one phrase. So Gardner used this phrase, and she writes these letters, and we back and forth to people, and she uses this phrase, "gentle pressure, relentlessly applied," which I really
Yeah.
liked. And I felt like I read that somewhere else, or I had heard that before. I don't know, but it might have been a you invention. So I want to give you credit if so. But I'm curious about where you came up with that and what that really means to that character.
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. I have a kind of very personal answer to it. My mother's catchphrase was gentle pressure, relentlessly applied.
Mm.
She found that it's sort of like a better way of saying you get better results not by trying to overturn the table and scatter everything around the room, but by continuing to nudge, to suggest, to sort of create word by word, line by line, gesture by gesture, the world that you're trying to live in. And that is sort of what that means for Gardner. Gardner is kind of a player within a machine that is bigger and more powerful than she is, but she finds a way herself to create a better outcome for as many women as she can on a sort of person by person, day by day basis. And she, in order to do that, has to do some things that make her very uncomfortable and unhappy. But she knows that that sort of gentle pressure, continuously and relentlessly applied, is the only way to work inside of a system that seems to be kind of bent on destroying things that are important to her and valuable to her.
Mm.
In my mother's life, it kind of had a different meaning. And my mother passed away in May, and so when we had her memorial service, a lot of people mentioned that they had heard her use this phrase. She kind of worked her way up from the very, very bottom of her career, of her industry, and had this decades-long career where she was a mentor for many, many people and really made a difference in a lot of people's lives, which is also something that people talked about a lot at the memorial service. But a lot of people came back to this, like the fundamental truism of this really impactful career that she had was this theory of gentle pressure relentlessly applied. Like, you don't have to go in there and like overturn the world. You just have to keep making the small incremental changes that the world that you're in really needs to see. And she, delivered results and she, really helped a lot of people along the way. So that's kind of where the phrase came from, and also what it means to me, and also to this character Gardner. She's, a woman living in a dystopian near future in which women face unimaginable risks and limitations. And the way that she's found to stay sane and to keep her hope in this world is to kind of keep making those incremental changes that she really has to believe will make a difference.
Yeah, yeah, and that's really beautiful, and that's great to know where that came from. So thank you for sharing. Uh, one of the things that struck me is while we're learning about, so Gardner has that kind of day job, she has this night job, and the story really unfolds in a very interesting way because we learn more and more about, like you say, this gentle pressure where she's doing more and more, she's doing it every day, all the time, and then she kind of goes off, and then it's not clear, what's really happening. But Carter comes in and is trying to piece that back together. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that piecing back together of what his sister was doing while he was away, I think is what makes the book so compelling. Um, but to me, again, what Carter, it's like two steps forward, one step back.
Yeah.
He gets close to
Yeah.
understanding what's happening, and then something bad happens. And like you say, he gets close, and then he ends up in a new tree, and there's new rocks or something. And he's trying to,
Yeah.
so
That's very much, yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
yeah, no, I mean, an example is, he finds out where Gardner works kind of secretly and tries to figure out what's going on, and maybe he can use that to find her somehow, and he ends up making things worse. Think
Yeah.
like the place that was helping women out in its sort of weird, crazy, convoluted way, as people will find out, ends up getting shut down because of him.
Right.
And I think this happens a lot through the book where he's sort of stumbling around. So, how is he dealing with the unintended consequences of his actions? How is he able to kind of push himself and move forward and keep focus?
Yeah, I mean the way that Carter's investigation kind of stumbles and shambles along on its route is very much based on or inspired by the sort of like that hard-boiled detective tradition where the main investigator is someone who may or may not be super qualified for that role and is constantly on the verge of either getting drunk or getting punched in the face. So that's
Yeah,
really Carter. He's sort of
right.
he is not a detective. He is not trained for this in any way. All he knows is that he's got to find some answers, and he has, really a personal stake in keeping his sister safe, but he doesn't know how to do it, and he doesn't know what he's getting into. So he's got that kind of like hard-boiled investigation kind of route to travel, and it definitely, gets him into some tricky places. He gets the crap beat out of him on a number of occasions, and is also really feeling increasingly desperate to try to figure out what happened as he, uncovers more about this world. So I think that there's something also about that stumbling, two steps forward, one step back, but earnest, determined effort that is really his journey toward trying to be a good man. Really what
Hmm.
Carter is trying to figure out in the end is, I was trying to be a good man in a war zone, and now I am home and I am trying to be a good man in what seems like this war zone of what happened to my older sister and my middle sister. Like they are facing risks that I didn't even realize when I was over there fighting this war. And what can I do? Like, what must I do? So, it's never a straight path and it's never an easy one, but he is this young man who's really gotta find it. So,
Yeah, yeah, and you use the word desperate, and I think that he's very relentless about it, and he is desperate, and it maybe slowly starts to turn into an obsession. I think over time he's getting knocked down, he's getting kicked out. His dad's telling him to just cut it out. He's getting everyone else is just pushing him away, and it seems like he's coming on stronger and stronger, and it makes him want to do it more and more. And I think at some point, it becomes difficult to really know why you're doing something, what's going on. He seems
Hmm.
to, almost lose touch with reality from time to time.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious about, how can we, for him and for us more broadly, how do we know when that's happening? How are we able to stay objective about our goals?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's something that combat veterans learn about sort of keeping things going and continuing to move forward, even when it seems like even and especially when it seems like, the situation has gotten so desperate that you can't find a way out. Like the only way out is through. And while you're in that place, your real priority and what you have to do is focus on keeping your friends alive, right? Like that's sort of a thread that continually comes up in writing by and about veterans is, even when things are, even and especially when things are at their worst, our primary responsibility is to each other. What do we have to do to keep each other safe when it seems like the world is on fire, and maybe it actually is. So that's a great focusing and in some ways comforting responsibility to have. We really have to look out for each other. That's the first job among many.
Hmm. And to just have a couple kind of questions here about Fred as we wrap up. We haven't talked too much about her, but she's a major character, and she got pregnant just against wildest odds, and the
Right.
whole book is her dealing with the ramifications of that. And she goes back and forth on this, but ends up marrying someone that is quite rich, and the family is very wealthy, and um, she can be taken care of, but there's obviously a big trade-off there. And I'm just curious about why she would make that decision. What would drive someone to make that kind of decision in
Right.
that position?
Well, not to give too much away, but sort of the situation that Fred finds herself in is very much one that, like, she is in an economic extreme. She she's basically forced into a corner out of which the only way that she can guarantee her own safety and her child's safety is to make this kind of terrible compromise for herself. I think that Fred as a character is also one of these people that's always going to find like a back door, or is always looking for one, like always looking for a way to bend the rules or kind of create an exception for herself. And I think that she makes this terrible step, really believing on some level that, oh, I'm going to be able to figure out how to make this work. I'm going to be able to figure out,
Mm.
a way out of this if I really need to. Um, I think that the next book that I'm working on is sort of picks up where this one leaves off, and will maybe explore whether that ends up working out for her the way that she thinks. But she does kind of take this step that's this huge compromise because she feels like it's her only way forward. And I think that it is one that a lot of women can really relate to. Childcare, childbirth, incredibly expensive, incredibly difficult in the United States in ways that it's not elsewhere in the world. We literally have the worst parental leave policies in the entire developed world. Childcare costs the most here that it does anywhere in the world. It's up to 30 to 40% of a parent's income. A lot of women are facing economic extremes that would be totally shocking, astonishing to even their parents, just with the rising cost of childcare in the United States. And so the sort of the system of regulations that Fred finds herself trapped in is the sort of next extreme, I guess, evolution of the situation that we're already in. And, you can think about what that what kinds of decisions that drives women to, and will drive them to in the future.
Mm. Yeah, and we learned a little bit more about Fred's kind of line of thinking when she kind of sends Carter off, and Carter gets to see these conversations that Fred and Gardner were having for months and months and months about what was going on.
Yeah, yeah.
And I really thought that part was interesting. I mean, you really devoted a chunk of the book to those kind of back and forth conversations, and they were kind of like written on the page in almost like a text message style, and it was really interesting. So one of the things that I really found most fascinating about it is kind of this like voyeuristic appeal to it all.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about what that experience was like for Carter. He's seen his sisters communicate between themselves. Presumably he's not ever seen that before. And it kind of broadened that, thinking about how we present ourselves differently, when we either are amongst a lot of, say, new people or people we don't know versus people that are our most intimate friends, and people in conversations where we don't ever expect anyone to find out about them.
Yeah, yeah. I had a lot of fun writing that section of the book, and partly, it sort of does replicate, as you say, this sort of like this tumbling, kind of self-perpetuating text kind of thing that so many of us find ourselves caught up in. Like, I'm sure all of us belong to at least one group text where it's just like, this thing is never going to end, and some days I love it and some days I hate it, and like that draw to that sort of easy, sort of shortened kind of format of conversation that is really, kind of developed and is unique to this modern world in which we live. So Carter finds himself sort of with access to this conversation between his sisters that sort of plays out in this format. And for him, he's reached a point in his investigation where he's just like, he's hopeless, and he's finding out truths that he doesn't want to face, and he's seeing and hearing about things that he doesn't understand and he can't really process. And for him, this access to this sort of back and forth conversation between his two sisters, who he loves so much, is at once so comforting for him. Like, just this kind of like feeling of being a little kid in bed, hearing like the grown-ups talk in the next room. Like, that's kind of what it evokes for him in a way. But then it also really makes very plain to him the incredible amount of danger that his two sisters are in, and kind of like the fire that they're playing with. Like, the two of them are doing things in this world that are very dangerous for both of them. And the more he finds out about it, the more danger he is probably going to be in, which is something that sort of dawns on him as he's really, really reading through this conversation. So there's this sense where you're sort of like getting sucked into something by the comfort of it and by the familiarity of the voices, and that sort of access to these people that you love and you want to feel connected to, but then sort of like the growing alarm and concern of realizing like, oh my gosh, like what they're actually talking about is really kind of scary. I think that there's something, about that evokes like what we were talking about earlier, this sense of, we're connected to this invisible sort of social and technological world through our devices and through our relationships and social media that is very gratifying and really wonderful and comforting in so many ways. But then, as we talked about earlier, there's this undercurrent of danger and sort of revelation there that sort of threatens to reveal a lot of secrets that, we would probably, secrets and private information that a lot of us would probably be better off not letting up so easy. So that section of the book really, I think, has a relationship to that kind of, the bargain of, access versus keeping your secret safe.
Right. So, I kind of want to start to wrap it up a little bit, and just, I like to ask generally, we've touched on so many different topics and gotten really deep into this wonderful book. Is there anything else you'd like to point out? Any other ideas or anything else you hope people would get from the book we haven't talked about?
Thanks for asking that. We really, I feel like, have covered a lot of ground in the conversation, but the one thing that I think makes me have, I think hope for the future is how much dystopian feminist fiction is out there right now. It really seems like this book is sort of being published into a little bit of a wave. And the thing that I think all of these great books have in common, and it's a wave of which I am really grateful to be even a tiny part, is that it's not a hopeless, serious, sad, bleak future that we're trying to write toward. It's actually, the opposite. Like, by telling these stories that sort of paint a vision of the world that is not the one that we want to see ourselves in, we understand, the power of the opposite and what we need to do to create that change. Like, I feel like, these stories, and hopefully the Completionists too, they're about hope. They're about, like being a good person and keeping your hope and your humanity in a world and in a place where that's really at risk. And that's really like our essential challenge right now.
Hear, hear.
Yeah.
You mentioned something you're working on. It sounds like somewhat of a sequel. Is there anything you want to tell us about?
No, I better not
No,
say
it's
anything
all
else.
lips are sealed. Okay, that's it. Too much already.
I just
No
don't
worries.
want to jinx it.
Stay tuned. Stay tuned. All right. Well, let's finish up. I'm going to ask you 3 quick getting to know you questions in our thunder round, and we'll call it a day. Sound good?
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Number 1. What is your favorite food and or drink?
Well, if I could live on anything, it would be fish tacos.
Ooh.
And I love a nice glass of rosé. I guess I'm sort of secretly a millennial, although I'm way too old for it.
Nope, that all people are allowed to enjoy rosé. Good rosé is delicious.
It is for all people, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Where's your favorite place you've ever been?
I've been to so many wonderful places. I've been very fortunate, but right now is the place where I am right now is one of my favorite places, which is the Isle of Palms in South Carolina. It's just beautiful and tranquil and one of my mom's favorite places. So I'm happy to be here.
Oh, well, that sounds great. All right, last question. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
Is it okay to say maybe making Trump not the president? I know that that's not everybody's point of view, but my gosh.
Your wand. Your wand.
Whew, I think we've got to do something about that. Yeah, maybe that wand becomes, I don't know, it becomes the next election.
Okay, done. Well, there we go. Thank you so much for joining me, Siobhan.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, John. It's great to meet you.
It was great to meet you too, and wonderful talking. The book, again, everyone, is The Completionist, out now. In case you haven't figured out, it's a fantastic read that touches on so many different societal issues and was really, really invigorating to get through. So I highly recommend it. Give it a go. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.